Now to other breaking news. The first Fox News national poll since the Paris attack shows how the wave of terror has reshaped that race since early November. Frontrunner Donald Trump has widened his lead, but Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz are also on the rise, threatening to overtake a slumping Ben Carson for the number 2 spot. Rubio tops the candidates on who's honest and trustworthy with a net score of plus 20, just above Ben Carson. Trump and Hillary Clinton are in negative territory. And when it comes to how GOP candidates run against Clinton, Rubio does the best against the presumptive Democratic nominee. Joining me now from the campaign trail is the Republican playing the hottest hand, Senator Marco Rubio. Senator, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
I know that you have a plan for how to fight ISIS, and I want to put it up on the screen. You say expand airstrikes, embed U.S. special ops with local forces, oust Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, and provide arms directly to Sunni and Kurdish forces. But, Senator, I want to ask you another specific question. In addition to that, would you also commit U.S. combat troops on the ground to fighting ISIS?
Well, one of the graphs that's missing in that plan is we need to have a ground force that defeats ISIS, and it should be made up primarily of Arab Sunnis. That's the only way you're going to defeat them. They have to be defeated by Arab Sunnis themselves. So they're going to have to be the bulk of the ground force. There will have to be American operators embedded alongside them. Special operators are combat troops. This is not a return to Iraq. We're not talking about 100,000 people or 50,000 armed soldiers, but we are talking about a significant force of special operators and others with specific missions that will have to be embedded alongside that Sunni Arab coalition that this president and the United States must put together if we are to defeat ISIS on the ground. It's the only way to do it. They have to be defeated by a ground force, and it has to be made up primarily of Sunnis.
You are clearly one of the foreign policy hawks in the current GOP field, but some of your opponents note that back in 2013, when Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, used chemical weapons, crossed the red line and used chemical weapons against his own people, that you voted against the use of force, allowing President Obama to use force against Assad. Why is that, sir?
Well, first of all, I don't support airstrikes against Assad now, and no one is calling for those now either. I thought, number one, it would be counterproductive, especially the way the president was describing what the strike should be. We shouldn't take symbolic military action or military action to send a message. You should only take military action if you have a very clear objective and you are providing the resources necessary to win. The second is, I offered an alternative to airstrikes at the time. I very clearly outlined what we should be doing instead. It included increased sanctions on institutions that were propping up Assad, but it also included a more robust effort to identify non-radical Sunni elements within Syria that we could empower to topple Assad, but also to ensure that no vacuums were being created for groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and others to take hold. I felt that airstrikes, and I still do, against Assad at the time would have been counterproductive. He would have survived, he would have remained in power, and it would have strengthened his hand and allowed him to send a message to the world that he had taken on the United States and still held on. In fact, it may have even rallied some in the Arab world to his side as a result of such a strike. So those are the reasons why I thought that should not have been the appropriate response at the time. If military response is the appropriate response, I will support it. And in the case of ISIS, it is the appropriate response to have additional airstrikes. But no one's calling on airstrikes on Assad now, and I thought it was wrong then, too.
But of course, the specific issue there was that the president had set the red line, and a lot of people thought that it hurt U.S. credibility not to follow up on his promise and authorize the use of force. Here was your reasoning back in 2013, sir.
I have never supported the use of military force, of U.S. military force in this conflict, and I still don't. I remain unconvinced that the use of force proposed here will work.
And some question the fact that in voting against authorizing force, you were voting along with Rand Paul, who you now call a committed isolationist.
Well, but for very different reasons. Senator Paul didn't want us not to conduct airstrikes. He didn't want us to do anything involving that conflict. I argued that the red line being crossed should have meant the U.S. should have openly and actively engaged in identifying non-jihadist elements on the ground in Syria that were trying to topple Assad and empower them to not just topple Assad, but to be able to govern the country in its aftermath. I thought that should have been the response even before the president laid out the red line. And I thought that once he used chemical weapons, that for sure would have triggered that sort of response. It did not. And the result is not only that Assad is still in power, but now Russia has moved into the region, and these radical jihadist groups have taken advantage of the vacuum that was left behind. So it is true that we had the same vote, but for very different reasons. And in fact, I called for us to do other things instead, and Senator Paul and others said for us not to do anything at all. And I thought that was a terrible mistake. We've seen what the result of that has been.
Senator, let's turn to what's become a very hot issue this last week, and that's the question of what to do about the Syrian refugees. You've put out a pretty firm line on that. You say you want to block the admittance of any Syrian refugees because you say, quite frankly, we don't have the information, the intel, the database to vet them properly. Does that mean that you will vote against the bill that was passed by the House this week overwhelmingly, which would allow Syrian refugees into the country but under tightened security?
No, my argument is that we can't allow anyone in this country that we can't vet. And I believe that the vast majority of refugees that are trying to come here are people we will not be able to vet. Does common sense still apply? Of course it does. A 5-year-old orphan, a 90-year-old widow, a well-known Chaldean priest. These are obviously common sense applications, and you can clearly vet them just by common sense. But what about someone who doesn't fit that profile? There is no reliable database that we can rely on. There is no existing government institution in their home country that we can call up and run them against.
But I guess the question...
We cannot vet most of these people.
But the question
the House bill, I think, is an appropriate response. And what you're going to find is a result of the House bill.
Because the House bill isn't going to create the databases that you say aren't there.
The House bill will require both the director of the FBI and of Homeland Security to personally certify that each person being admitted has been fully vetted and that they're confident that they're not going to be terrorists. They won't be able to do that in most cases because even they will tell you in both, in private conversations, and some have said it publicly, that we do not have the capability today to fully vet people that are coming from that region of the world. We just don't have the access to information that will allow us to do that.
But let me pick up on that if I can, Senator Rubio, because critics say that you and all the other Republicans, or a lot of the other Republicans, are misleading the American people about how detailed the vetting process is. They note that the UN now checks Syrian refugees out in refugee camps in the region for 4 to 10 months. Then U.S. officials pick up the vetting and screen them for 18 to 24 months. And they say, given how easy it is for those refugees to get into Europe, why would an ISIS operative want to wait 3 years, go through all of that vetting to try to get into the U.S.?
Well, that question answers itself. The United States is the ultimate prize in their mind. If ISIS is able to conduct a successful operation in the U.S., or I believe even Canada for that matter, of the scale of what you saw in Paris, that would be an enormous bonanza for them in terms of funding, but also of recruits from all over the world. That would be a huge messaging win for ISIS and continue to grow their movement. The second point is, it's not that the vetting is not extensive. It is that the databases do not exist. When you're vetting someone, you are basically comparing them to information that you've acquired. And in the case of people coming from that part of the world today, we do not have good information about that part of the world. We have even less information about people coming from Syria than we did with the Iraqi refugees after the aftermath of that war 5 or 10 years ago. And so it's not that the vetting isn't happening, is that the vetting does not have reliable data to which we can compare it against.
Okay,
and that's the problem.
Let me switch subjects about something that I suspect you're going to want to talk about, which is your rising standing in the polls. As we pointed out in the latest Fox News national poll, you're now tied for 3rd place, and you've risen just this month. In Iowa, the Real Clear Politics average of recent polls here in Iowa has you 3rd at 12.8%. In New Hampshire, you're running 2nd to Donald Trump at 12.3%. And Senator, you have a new ad out which focuses on the fight against ISIS. Here's a clip.
These are radical terrorists who want to kill us because we let women drive, because we let girls go to school. I'm Marco Rubio. I approve this message because there can be no arrangement or negotiation. Either they win or we do.
Senator, do you think that your foreign policy credentials are giving you a boost with voters as they focus more on choosing a commander-in-chief with all of these terror attacks?
Well, on these polls, obviously, you want good news, not bad news, but we've never gotten too excited or too depressed about them. They're going to fluctuate between now and Election Day, especially in early states where voters wait until the last week, the last day oftentimes, to make their decision. As far as national security, let me just say I obviously am not happy about the events that happened last week in Paris, but I think it's a positive development that it suddenly has forced Americans to confront more carefully the issue of national security, because it is the most important thing a president will do, and it is the most important function of the federal government. And I hope that we focus on that more, not just for political advantage, but because the world has become a very dangerous place. It's not just radical jihad, it's the Chinese military buildup, it's Russian aggression, it's North Korea's dozens of nuclear warheads, it's Iran's desire to acquire a nuclear weapon capability. These are all very real risks, and we are eviscerating our military capabilities at a time when the world is growing more dangerous.
Senator,
so I'm glad we're focusing on national security, and I feel very confident in my position and in talking about those issues.
Senator, we're running out of time. I want to ask you a couple of final quick political questions. You generally stay away from attacking your rivals, the other candidates in the GOP field, but you went after Ted Cruz this week for his vote to kill the telephone bulk data collection program, which actually will run out a week from today. What do you think that vote says about Ted Cruz?
Well, it's not going after anyone personally. This is an important issue because we have a debate within our own party about what the proper role of government is in these intelligence programs. And there are members of the Republican Party, that includes Senator Cruz and Senator Paul, who have argued that somehow the federal government is out there spying on everybody, and so we need to gut these programs. That isn't true. If someone in the federal government is caught spying on an American, they should be fired and prosecuted. But these are valuable tools in the war on terror that allow us to learn more about these terrorists than they know about us, and allow us to identify them and potentially disrupt plots before they're carried out. And if you have voted to harm those programs and undermine those programs, then we need to have a debate about that, because it is a very different view of what the government's role should be in our national security. That is a legitimate policy debate.
Absolutely. On the other hand, another legitimate policy debate, Senator Cruz has been hammering you in the last few days for your support for comprehensive immigration reform in 2013. Here is Senator Cruz.
The Rubio campaign is trying very, very hard to change the topic of discussion away from Marco's longtime support and partnership with Chuck Schumer and Barack Obama pushing a massive amnesty plan.
I got about 30 seconds left. Is there something personal between the two of you?
No, this is a policy difference as well, except that Ted Cruz himself supported the legalization of people that were here illegally. He offered an amendment that actually would have allowed that to happen.
Well, wait.
And then 2 months after the debate on the Senate bill.
But he says that was a poison pill to try to kill comprehensive reform.
Well, that's not accurate. In fact, in September of that year, 3 months after that debate had ended, he was still telling the New York Times and others how he supported legalizing those that were here illegally. So if he's changed this position, then that's fine. He has a right to do that. He needs to answer the question of what he would do with those people that are here illegally. He's the only Republican candidate. In fact, he's the only candidate for president that's, to this point, refuses to answer the question of what do we do with people that are here illegally. And I think that's an important point. And I've laid out a clear plan forward on that issue. And, I'm more than happy to continue to have the debate over that issue as well.
Well, and we're happy to have you here to continue that debate. Senator Rubio, thank you so much for your time today. Happy Thanksgiving to you and your family, sir.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.